So, welcome to part two of our lecture on European imperialism. And we kind of left off, among other things, talking about how increasingly economic factors are not the only consideration driving European colonization, right? So, and related to this, we're really going to see things pick up from the 1870s up until the outbreak of the First World War, which is one reason we often kind of see this as marking a distinct period in terms of imperialism. We refer to the period as that of new imperialism. And again, right, economics still a major factor, but increasingly the pursuit of empire is for empire's sake, right? Involving a host of factors, economic ones, but also those related to prestige, geopolitical considerations, and so forth, right? It's becoming this very aggressive competitive thing. In fact, there's always this kind of underlying fear that this kind of aggressive competition for colonies could lead to a European-wide conflict. So later on, if you're looking at factors that brought about the First World War, this would definitely be one of them. A major factor here, though, is simply the fact that much of the world has been colonized. There just isn't a lot of unoccupied territory. So if you really feel that you need to have colonies, there's kind of a feeling you better move fast before what remains is gobbled up by someone else. Now, one other development alongside of this that in many ways kind of characterizes the period of new imperialism is the emergence of certain racial doctrines, right, which are used to justify the colonizing of non-European peoples, right? This kind of assumption about the superiority of Europeans, that these subjugated people are uncivilized and therefore, we're kind of engaging in a civilizing mission. They are unfit to govern themselves and so forth. But this is more in the vein of explanation after the fact, right? I mean, kind of a justification for something you were going to do for other reasons. Certainly is not the reason European powers are actually conquering these people. But again, things are really going to pick up during this period, during which the European colonizing nations will add nearly 8,880,000 square miles to their overseas colonial possessions. By the late 1880s, about the only place left on the globe that is largely unoccupied is Africa, and it will become the primary target of this new imperialist expansion. And by the way, this is where we really start to see economic considerations taking a backseat to other ones, and where a lot of this is going to be driven by the fear that if you don't move quickly enough, someone else will get there first. Just to be sure, conquest will continue to take place elsewhere. We already talked about, what France was doing in Southeast Asia and on the East Asian seaboard. And we might throw in there the fact that you have a newly arisen power, that of Japan, which has joined the European powers in their scramble for territory. Now, if we're going to talk about the European colonization of Africa, we should probably start with Egypt. So some of this is a bit of a review of developments that we already discussed when we were examining reform efforts in the so-called Islamic heartland. So you might recall that in the middle of the 19th century, Egypt was effectively an autonomous state and had become heavily indebted in an attempt to rapidly modernize under Ismail Pasha. And one consequence of that was that they actually ended up losing control of the Suez Canal to the British. This was during the conservative government of Benjamin Disraeli. And so, this is kind of worth highlighting because the Suez Canal would come to be seen as incredibly important to the British Empire, right? If India was the crown jewel of the British Empire, the Suez Canal was often described as its lifeline, primarily because it gave the British much more immediate access to India. And of course, the construction of the Suez Canal was a major reason Egypt had become so heavily indebted. Here we see the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. You might remember that Ismail threw a lavish party spending about 2 million Egyptian pounds, a very large sum for that time. So kind of a good indication of why Egypt became so heavily indebted, primarily to the British and French. And you might also recall that eventually the British and French had imposed upon Egypt something called the dual financial control in 1878. in large measure to protect the money that was owed them. Some of it owed to the British and French governments, but many to private lenders, banks, individuals, and so forth. The dual financial control essentially put the British and French in charge of Egyptian finances, right? And it was represented by an English official being in control of revenue and a French official managing the country's expenditures. So in effect, it was a constitutional ministry, right? A British official as Minister of Finance, a French minister as Minister of Public Works. And we already discussed how, if foreign powers are controlling your finances, you can't really say that a country is independent. One consequence of this was the Urabi movement, which sought to prevent Egypt's domination by foreign powers, among other things. And eventually the British in particular came to see this as a threat, and that had led to the British conquest of Egypt in 1882. And they would effectively occupy Egypt from that point forward up until, depending on how you define occupation, 1954. And with that development, I think it is fair to say that the scramble for Africa was underway. And within a very short period of time, pretty much all of Africa would be divided up between the different European powers, the lion's share of it going to the British and French, right? So just kind of briefly reviewing the map, the kind of bright pink color indicating territories that would end up part of the British Empire, the blue representing French territories, but then we have a few other countries involved. The bright green, by the way, kind of really corresponding to the first wave of imperialism, kind of what remained in part of the Portuguese Empire, and then kind of reflective of this kind of growing sensibility that you couldn't be considered a great power unless you had colonies. We have the dark green representing Italy and the brown representing Germany. And those two countries are a really good example of where economics was hardly a factor at all. It really was simply, were these newly unified countries kind of, late to the game, and we need to grab whatever colonies we can as quickly as possible. Why do I have the image of the adventures of Tintin there? Some of you might be familiar with him. He's a Belgian, a character from a Belgian comic. Very popular in Europe, not quite as well known in the United States. And the image here, and it should be noted, sadly, that a lot of the Tintin comics very often have these kind of racist images that probably more reflect the mentality of the time than any intention on the part of the author. But certainly this is evident with this particular issue, right, which has to do with Tintin's adventures in the Congo. And really does kind of, I think, reflect very nicely or illustrate very nicely the kind of the European mentality about Africa at the time, right? That, this kind of mysterious region of jungle and wild animals and semi-barbaric people, and here is the intrepid and very brave European explorer bringing, kind of representing civilization, entering this, completely barbaric realm. Now, it's really ironic, and you might recall from looking at that map that the British ended up gaining more territory in Africa than any other European power. Going into the scramble for Africa, the British actually expressed tremendous reluctance. They really made it clear that they really didn't desire colonies in Africa. Right. So first of all, the scramble for Africa is marking a major transition from a policy of informal empire to one of direct control. And just by way of reminder, you might remember we talked about the whole idea behind informal empire, right, is to take a very rational approach, right, kind of cost-benefit analysis, right, careful consideration of exactly what interests you have in a territory, especially economically, and then thinking very carefully about how you might ascertain those interests at minimal cost. And in particular, if you can avoid having to be directly responsible for their administration and defense. And, so that still kind of reflects the British mindset. And added to that, they actually indicate a kind of skepticism concerning Africa's profitability. Right? There are many in Britain who feel that colonizing Africa would actually result in a net loss to the British Empire. right? And and by the way, I mean, this does reflect a historian's perspective. When we look at the diplomatic documents, all indications are that the British were quite sincere in their desire to avoid colonizing Africa, really any part of it. So what happened? Well, some of this reflects what we might call creeping colonialism, right? Where because of individuals on the ground who perhaps have some degree of influence with the government, you kind of get drawn in spite of yourself. One major consideration, though, is the balance of power, which increasingly is coming into play, right? There's this kind of consideration that, at some point, right, from the British point of view, the ideal would be that nobody in Europe goes into Africa, right? But then there is the recognition that if you don't take control of certain territories, someone else will, right? So, I mean, that's the reality. And so, then you end up going in, not because you really want the territory, but because you want to make sure that the French or the Germans or the Italians don't get there first. So that is, kind of reflects the growing importance of balance of power. And all of this again, right? Things becoming very competitive in a very aggressive way, right? There's this kind of growing fear that any kind of conflict that might take place on the African continent between European powers might very quickly spill over to Europe. And so, the question becomes how to cool things down. Especially things are heating up in the center, in the lower Congo River region, where the French, Belgian, and Portuguese are all starting to bump heads, right? The guy who actually tries to settle things down, believe it or not, is Bismarck, our old friend who unified Germany, and is very concerned that any conflict that might take place in Europe at this point would go very poorly for Germany, right? They might find themselves ganged up upon by a number of powers. The French are still very resentful about how things went down during the Franco-Prussian War. So he convenes the Berlin Conference in 1884-85, basically with the idea of having representatives of all the great powers show up and kind of work out through negotiations who is going to get what bit of Africa. And here we see the convening of the Berlin Conference in 1884. All these lovely gentlemen representing the great powers of Europe. But there is one interested party who will not be represented here at all: Africa. That is because Africa is not viewed as a participant in the scramble for Africa. They are, in fact, the cake, the prize, right? I love this political cartoon. We see Bismarck kind of dividing up the cake of Africa between the different European parties. So how do they decide who gets what? Right? They seek to regulate the competition by defining effective occupation as the criterion for the international recognition of territorial claims. Right? So basically, this formulation calls for the various European powers to create as many facts on the ground before they show up in order that they have a basis for claiming this or that territory. So, basically the idea, right, that if you can show that you have some kind of presence in a particular region, then that will validate your claim to it. The one thing that is not taken into account are the feelings of the indigenous states and peoples who are effectively being occupied. Not all outcomes in Africa will be determined at the Berlin Conference. There are some developments in South Africa that reflect more tensions developing between British settlers. Their base of operation was the Cape of South Africa, which the British had actually taken over in 1795, kind of a foothold there. And they're starting to come into conflict with the earlier Dutch settlers, often referred to as the Boer. This is a good example of how creeping colonialism works, right? Where you have these British settlers who, for various reasons, are going to start putting pressure on the British government to protect them. And that eventually will bring the British into South Africa and will become the basis for first, you have the first and then the second Boer War that eventually brings all of South Africa under British control. So I think creeping colonialism definitely worth a closer look. It's probably the driving force behind British expansion in Africa. Again, due to pressures exerted by various individuals and factions, often representing their own very narrowly defined interests that didn't necessarily correspond with British imperial interests, right, such as were being formulated by British officials in the government. The thing is, right, very often these individuals wielded disproportionate influence over the British government. And a really good example of this would be Cecil John Rhodes, who through his privately owned British South Africa company really put pressure on the British government to expand British control of East Africa. And why was this so important to him, right? He had a dream. Rhodes dreamed of a railway connecting Cape Town in the south to Alexandria in the north, and this would be greatly facilitated by British control of all the territory in between, right, through which the rail system would have to pass. And in fact, so the British would end up occupying almost the entirety of East Africa. It's worth noting one of those colonies would actually come under his direct control and bear his name, Rhodesia, today known as Zimbabwe. Right, so if you look at the map there, kind of giving you an idea, considering Sudan already considered a part of Egypt, then Uganda, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe at the time known as Rhodesia, right on down to South Africa. And I love the political cartoon on the right. Cecil John Rhodes, 1 foot in South Africa, 1 foot in Egypt, and straddling the continent, illustrative of his dream to build a trans-African rail system, but also perhaps of the tremendous influence he wielded on the British government. And so there you have it. The British, who were the most reluctant participant in the scramble for Africa, emerged in 1914 with the largest overseas empire, not least thanks to her long-standing presence in India, but also because of the tremendous gains she had made in Africa, right? Between 1885 and 1914, the British brought nearly 30% of Africa's population under control, double what the French brought under French control, and then, going down the line, 9% for Germany, 7% for Belgium, and 1% for Italy. And in many ways, the scramble for Africa really, a good example of how from this point forward, up until World War I, colonialism is in most respects about kind of asserting great power status, about political rivalries between the European powers, many of them playing themselves out in the scramble for Africa. This is especially evident in the behavior of Germany, much of this specifically having to do with its relationship with France. Particularly, since the time of the Franco-Prussian War, there's a lot of bad blood between both, but probably more so on the part of the French. And just by way of reminding, it was a very humiliating defeat, had forced Napoleon III to step down. You might recall that the Germans celebrated German unification in the Palace of Versailles. Right? This is something that really stuck in the craw of the French. Now, for quite a while after that, the dominant political figure in Germany is going to be our old friend Otto von Bismarck, who pretty much had engineered the unification of Germany, had been really the guy running the government in Prussia up until that point, then of Germany, initially minister-president of Prussia, then chancellor of Germany. And so on the one hand, he's under tremendous pressure to assert Germany's place as a great power. Right? And again, there's kind of this idea you're not a great power unless you have colonies. So he pursued a policy known as Weltpolitik, right? World politics, basically asserting Germany's quote-unquote place in the sun. That's actually a phrase they use quite often, particularly when we have a new Kaiser Wilhelm II. That it should be commensurate with Germany's strength militarily, but also as a rising industrial power. And again, this idea that they were thus entitled to colonies. And Germany will get colonies, many of them in Africa. So they will have colonies in Togoland, that very narrow strip that we see in the western part of Africa. Then just to the east of that, the Cameroons. Then in the southwest corner, what today is Namibia, then known as Southwest Africa, and Tanganyika. And the thing is, right, as long as Bismarck was calling the shots, he was very careful not to upset potential colonial rivals. That was a major factor in why he had kind of organized the Berlin Conference. He was especially careful of the French, who he knew were extremely sensitive about anything that Germany did, particularly if it felt like it was an affront to France, or in this case, for instance, not properly taking into account French interests colonially. But it's not going to be only Germany, right? Italy, also newly unified, trying to assert that it too should be considered a great power, therefore should have colonies. Very often they kind of imagine their colonial empire as a recreation of the Roman Empire, so kind of focusing on the Mediterranean. Hence why Italy ends up colonizing what will become Libya, initially made up of a number of territories, among them Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. And then they will actually at some point invade Ethiopia. That doesn't go too well, but they do manage to occupy some territory on the Horn of Africa. And even tiny little Belgium getting in on the act, they will colonize a very large part of the center of Africa, the Congo. Though it's kind of interesting, they actually treat it as the personal property of the ruler of Belgium, Leopold II. And, probably even by the standards of that day, it was generally considered that the Belgian really mismanaged their colony, very abusive to indigenous people and so forth. One very famous story associated with the Congo, the deepest, darkest, most mysterious part of Africa, when a fellow named Henry Morton Stanley went on a rescue mission looking for the lost Dr. Livingstone, who he did in fact encounter, very famously when he saw him. He's often been quoted as saying Dr. Livingstone, I presume. And, this was kind of very representative of how most Europeans viewed Africa, right? It's this kind of, deep, dark, mysterious territory, one of the most unexplored parts of the world. Even though the British had considered it not to be lucrative to colonize Africa, there was still the idea that there were tremendous resources yet to be discovered. And the Congo, what they called the Congo Free State, actually acquired through the International African Association on behalf of Leopold II, again, treated as his personal property, to the extent that he was, free to do as he wanted with the native peoples. And again, by the standards even of that time, considered to be very substandard, right? Very atrocious. And it's a very large territory, right? 900,000 square miles that would make up the Congo Free State. But it wasn't just the European powers. We already talked about how at some point Japan is going to be acquiring colonies in the Pacific, and we've already learned from a previous chapter at the expense of China and the United States, where increasingly voices are demanding that the United States demonstrate its great power status by acquiring colonies. In fact, that was the main impetus behind the Spanish-American War of 1898 that saw the United States go to war with Spain. Primarily, they kind of instigated it with the idea of, in that way, taking territory away from Spain, what remained of their empire. Particularly in the New World, the United States acquired Cuba and Puerto Rico, but also the Philippines. And by the way, the gentleman on the right there, of course, a future American president and gaining notoriety for his participation in the war, a war that he strongly advocated for, Theodore Roosevelt. And as we already discussed, right, all this colonial expansion really ran the risk of starting a war, right? I mean, the problem is that you have these expanding empires. At some point, they're likely to run into each other, laying claim to the same territory, and then that might lead to war, a war that might then very quickly spread to Europe. And this, in fact, almost happened in 1898 with what's known as the Fashoda Incident, right? So basically, the British were expanding southwards from Egypt. The French were expanding from Western Africa headed east. And at some point, they bumped into each other at a place called Fashoda, today known as Kodak. It's on the banks of the White Nile in territory today corresponding to modern-day Sudan. And so, it came very close to conflict, but in the end, the French blinked first, and so it ended up a diplomatic victory for the British, right? They avoided war. The British ended up getting the Sudan, kind of came to be considered part of Egypt. But then the British and French were like, in order to avoid this happening again, it might be a good idea if we, kind of had a mechanism for consulting with one another regarding colonial claims. So what they worked out is something called the Entente Cordiale, kind of like friendly meeting or cordial meeting. And, basically the way it worked is that the military leaderships of the respective armies of Britain and France would periodically meet and then, would share information about respective colonial claims, sort it out between them, and that way they could avoid conflict. And that's really all it was. Some of you might have heard of the Entente Cordiale because eventually it's going to evolve into something quite different, a defensive alliance between the British and French, primarily directed at Germany. And now we're going to find out why that happens. There's going to be a series of crises, or more precisely two, both of which will involve Morocco. And so, at the beginning of the 20th century, Morocco actually one of the few parts of Africa that hasn't been colonized, still an independent state, actually a very old kingdom at this point. It might surprise some people to know that Morocco was the first country in the world to recognize the newly independent United States after the American Revolutionary War. But in any event, right, coming up on 1905, what is becoming clear is that the French are getting ready to make a move. And they've already consulted with the British on this. The British are cool with it. They have no interest in Morocco. And in fact, most of the international community is fine with this. And then out of nowhere, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany shows up in Tangiers, a city to the north of Morocco, which, by the way, is where my grandparents come from, and makes a speech in favor of Moroccan independence. And this really takes the international community, and particularly the French, by surprise. This is seen as directly challenging the French colonial presence there, their imperialistic intentions with respect to Morocco. You might be wondering, why is the Kaiser doing this? It's a bit more complicated than what I'm going to relate here, but the gist of it is that he is under the strong impression that the British and French really hate each other. And that if he sides with the Moroccans against the French, the British will back him up, and this will drive a wedge between the British and French, and kind of push the British more into the German camp, if you will, right? And the possibility of a future war. So a number of problems with this. First of all, as already mentioned, the British and French have been in consultation over this, and the British are fine with it. Some of this reflects the fact that Wilhelm II, he's one of those individuals who thinks he's a lot more clever than he actually is. And you no longer have Bismarck calling the shots, right? Somebody who probably would have been savvy enough to know that this isn't really something that's going to work. In any event, in order to avoid conflict, an international conference is called in the city of Algeciras, which is in the south of Spain, in 1906 to settle the dispute. And apparently, much to the surprise of the Kaiser, pretty much all of the countries participating, including Britain, support France. But, in order not to really, let's say help the Germans not completely lose face in this particular instance, the resulting agreement, which is signed in May of 1906, does see France relinquish some of its claims with respect to Morocco, basically putting off its occupation to another day. But eventually that other day comes in 1911, and the French again getting ready to move into Morocco, when out of the blue, a German gunboat appears off the port of Agadir in the south of Morocco. And again, everyone's kind of like, you got to be kidding me, right? And the Germans this time are demanding compensation. They're saying, listen, if we're giving up our interests in Morocco, we demand compensation, maybe colonial territory elsewhere, before we accept French control of Morocco. And everyone's like, what interests are you talking about? Like, you really are not active in Morocco at all. In any event, eventually another conference, the signing of a convention, November of 1911, and Germany is like, okay, we accept France's position in Morocco, and they get colonies in other parts of Africa. In fact, some of the ones that we talked about earlier. And shortly after that, the French move into Morocco. They don't actually designate it an outright colony. They call it a protectorate, one of my favorite colonial terms. Basically, we're here to protect you. And the Moroccans are like, no, we're fine. That's okay. And like, no, we insist. And this is formalized with the Treaty of Fez signed on March 30th, 1912, making Morocco effectively a colony of France. But perhaps an even more significant outcome of the two Moroccan crises is that it served to reinforce the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France. And you might remember, this started out as a mechanism for resolving conflictual colonial claims, right, where the leadership of the respective British and French militaries would periodically consult about colonial claims. Well, now they're not talking about colonial claims, right? The respective heads of their militaries are talking about what is perceived as the imminent threat posed by Germany. And there are a number of other factors that are driving this perception, but the Moroccan crises definitely played a major role in this regard. Both the British and French seeing Germany as a common enemy, and this will be one of a number of alliances that will constitute a major factor bringing about the First World War. But of course, that is a different story, and we're not really going to be picking it up this time around. So, by way of conclusion, just reminding you to respond to the lecture-based questions for this lecture as per usual.